or don't have control over. And I think it's really something, I mean, how many people were here in the last talk? So I think what's interesting, if you look at a lot of the defensive mechanisms or even the offensive mechanisms that were talked about, there's a lot of assumptions that you own the network, you have really tight control over the network and a lot of the infrastructure and even the machines on that network. And so I think that's something that we see fundamentally changing. And I want to take you through some of the things in talking with a lot of different security practitioners, how they're dealing with this type of change and what it really means. So before I kind of dive into that, just wanted to give you a little bit about me. This is me at work a few years ago, right? That's me when I'm not with my family or at work. I'm usually on a sailboat as much as possible, so that's kind of me at play. I've worked at a number of technology companies, from small to large, from kind of research and development to more traditional enterprise. And right now I work at Pony. So some of you may know Pony. How many of you have heard of Pony Express before? Great. And most of you probably know Pony from more of the kind of pen testing, drop ship devices, right? Pony really came out of the box with, some of the early stuff. This is you talk about the pen testing that we were talking about. This was a box that basically you could inconspicuously put into an environment and then have, access to the wired and wireless networks and start doing pen testing. The air freshener is another example of, a way to start doing pen testing very inconspicuously in an environment. We have the Pwn phone, which was actually on Mr. Robot a couple of this season. So there's definitely a lot of expertise that we've built up in terms of how do you use devices as a way to really do pen testing, test a lot of environments, and find and exploit vulnerabilities, part of that red team that was really talked about. But as we've really worked with a lot of customers, there was a lot of interest in that's great on the red team side, but I really want to now, we see more and more devices coming into our environment. We see that we don't necessarily own them, and we'll get into this, but the notion of, well, how can I actually use these types of devices, not just to do a one-time test or penetration test, how do I actually understand what's in my environment continually test them, see what's coming in. And that's really what's led us to develop a system, and really a lot of the insights I'm going to share with you come from our working with customers to now really look at, as people will move to more BYOD, and we're even starting to see IoT creep into the enterprise, how do you start to deal with that threat vector? And the way I like to look at this is really, I call it the 5 stages of admitting you're losing control, and that you have a BYOD and IoT security problem. Okay? So I'm going to take you through some of these, and some of them are a little tongue-in-cheek, but I think there's a lot of true sentiment here in the way that we've historically looked at securing our networks, securing our systems, and ultimately securing the data in our companies or in our personal lives. So I like to look at phase 1 of BYOD denial. Okay? And I think you heard this a lot, actually, in the example blue team person who was up here. We have everything locked down. We have total control. I think that's when people first start talking about BYOD or devices coming in, contractor, just the notion that the company or the business is pushing to have more and more flexibility of what comes into your environment. The typical response is, hey, we've got it all locked down. We've got a really tight network. This is a little tongue-in-cheek from Dilbert about how we think we have super controls over our environment. But I think this is a way we think about it. And we did a survey last year, and in fact, 37% of those we sampled didn't even know what was on their network. So forget about having tight control of what comes on and off. A lot of people don't even know what's there to begin with. And this is just your everyday vanilla kind of network that we're talking about. So, to me, that's step 1 of we come from this environment where we think we have tight control over the network, or we need tight control over the network, tight control over the systems on it to do security as we know it. So I kind of view that as stage 1. Stage 2 then becomes, we kind of call them the lawyers, right? So the business wants flexibility. They want people to be coming in 24/7 on the network and bring in their own things. And so that's when people say, okay, we'll do an acceptable use policy, right? So now if I bring in my own system and I sign up, I'm going to sign up that I'm not doing these things. And it's kind of phase 2 of, great, I have control, but you want to have access, you got to subscribe to these certain rules and policies. And what's really interesting on this is there was a pretty interesting study where a company offered free Wi-Fi on the street. And they said in the EULA that people signed up with, they basically said the recipient agrees to assign their firstborn child to us for the duration of eternity. Okay? And I think it was something like 2,000 people signed up. Only 2 people, right, said anything about this. So, this is kind of the point of when we come from an environment where we really think we have control, we want control, control equals security. And then when we start to get, the business starts to push and want to push that limit, we tend to go, oh, we'll have an end-user agreement. It's kind of phase 1. But I think more and more we're seeing in the news and just people's awareness of security, whether it's connected cars, right? That's kind of, when you look at IoT or more devices coming in, this is kind of where everyone starts. It's kind of, hey, not really enterprise. It's kind of interesting, but, it's these things are vulnerable. Just yesterday, I think it was, right? J&J warns that one of their insulin pumps is actually susceptible. And what's interesting with all these is these aren't some new, incredibly specific hacks that need to be done. This example is just unencrypted wireless communication with a device that's, attached to your side, can inject insulin, and has a wireless controller. Okay? Same with the cars. These are more and more we're seeing communication and software go into devices that we've never seen before. So you have a lot of hardware manufacturers who haven't built software, and now they're integrating software into everything. And also last week, right, we saw one of the largest DDoS attacks on Krebs' website, and that was all, farmed from an IoT devices. So we're seeing this start to, people have been talking about it for a while, but it's actually starting to happen. Big Y, I don't know if people are familiar with Big Y. It's a grocery chain in the Northeast. They just found 5, skimmers, credit card skimmers in their environment. So what's interesting with all these is I think we're used to the notion of people are going to go after some big corporation, a big hack, takes a lot of time, you get in, take a lot of data out, where the proliferation of these devices, interconnected devices, it's easier now to go target smaller places, get in, whether it's with social engineering or just getting in the front door, and dropping in physical devices. That's a huge way, physical devices that are connected to the internet. It's easy to actually get onto networks and exploit different environments. That's becoming a key way to get in. And so we're seeing more and more that this is a way criminals are actually getting into environments and starting to take information. And we're not really prepared for that when we look at how we typically secure environments. So that leads usually, what I find in talking to people, to kind of stage 3 of saying, okay, something is different, or the way I've approached security historically is, not necessarily the reality that we're in today. And so we tend to see people who used to think their company had complete control over their network, realize that, wow, I've got, wireless networks, I've got remote sites, I've got my wired infrastructure, I've got guest networks, and I do not have good controls over all those places, right? And then 2, with the actual devices connecting to them, more and more, they don't own them. They can't control them. They can't put stuff on them. And we'll talk a little about how people tend to react to this challenge with looking at the tools they have. But I think people start to realize, look, half of the devices, others will say more, but half of the devices connecting enterprise networks next year are not even going to be owned by the company, whether it's IT, whether security has a say in what's on those machines. So it's the diversity and ownership of devices are really changing. And then finally, I think we've historically thought that, hey, when something comes into my environment, it connects to my network, maybe a few other networks, but it's really shifted to where these devices are connecting 24/7 to anything they can connect to. Right? If you have, your phone's on AT&T, if you're connected to a Wi-Fi network, you walk out, it automatically tries to connect to AT&T. right? So these things are so thirsty for connectivity that they'll connect to anything to get internet access. So all of these, I think, are really fundamentally changing the way we need to look at how we secure our environments. And another interesting topic from the last talk, is this notion of device-to-device communication. We're very used to, I connect to the network, that's how I get all my data. That's really changing too. So, sure, maybe let's take, for example, that you have your network's completely locked down, which may be in a few locations, but certainly not in very distributed environments. The amount of connectivity that's now happening from the devices on your network to machine networks, whether it's through Bluetooth, whether they're connecting to other networks, that is a whole new threat vector that people are starting to exploit, starting to understand that we're just not prepared to really address. So I like to look at this a little of how we've historically looked at our networks and all the new connectivity that's in and around the enterprise networks most of us are tasked with securing. And, on the lower left is really how I look at how we thought traditionally. We've got HQ, we've got remote sites, and I'm going to headquarters usually more secure than remote sites. Usually have a lot more expertise and security staff there, and remote sites maybe a lot more vulnerable. But that's just one piece of, I think, really what you have to consider today when you look at both what's around your environment and what your clients, what the machines on your network are actually connecting to. Whether it's open Wi-Fi networks around your environment, it makes it, we've seen at both Black Hat, at DEF CON, at the Super Bowl, we were covering the Super Bowl, the amount of karma attacks and open APs, it is such an easy way to get people off your network onto and have a great man in the middle that whole wireless side of connectivity is really vulnerable. We also see that the amount of Bluetooth and just rogue devices that are coming in. We talked about the credit card skimmers, but Bluetooth, there's now Bluetooth credit card skimmers. So people come in and drop a little skimmer in. They never even have to come to your environment anymore. They drive by, suck all the data down. So the piece of using actually pretty cheap, really cheap, under $100 devices that are outfitted with Bluetooth, wireless, easy to put into a location and start gathering data that never has to go on your network, right? So, and then IoT devices. We're really just starting to see this come on, but we've had clients, for example, who facilities went and installed a whole bunch of new locks, and they happen to be Bluetooth-enabled locks, but no one told anybody about that. They were never configured to be, any settings on them, so they were kind of open in their default pairing mode. And the security team was actually able to detect them and say, well, what is this going on? But we're seeing, I think, a real intersection now of physical security, cyber, information security, and actual, safety. So that's going to permeate more and more as well. So I think we tend to think of IoT as very much consumer. I think we're going to see a lot more into the enterprise, both enterprises deploying IoT networks to optimize their business, but they're actually sitting there, maybe not on your network, but they're taking data from your environment and sharing it to external places. So all these are new ways that data can, come out of an environment that I think we're just really not, we haven't been thinking about. And that kind of leads to stage 4, as I like to call it, existing solutionitis, which you're always trying to look at, hey, I've invested so much, I have all these tools, I'm sure I can use these to meet what I need. And just want to give you a take of where some of these can actually, no question you can do a lot with these, but there's certain key aspects, I think, that are shifting, and as we look at the change in control and ownership. So, for example, NAC, which in this case I like to call network assumed control, right? So the notion of, it's a very infrastructure out view of the world. So it assumes that I can lock down my network. It's very controlled environments. It's looking more at, it's airspace blind, so it's not looking at your wireless, it's not looking at Bluetooth, it's not seeing what's kind of around trying to connect to your network, it's just looking at the network and trying to control zones and such. So it's effective, but it's hard to scale into a very large deployment, very expensive cost-wise and operational-wise. But then we look at IDS. And IDS really, I think people not so much try to use IDS to fight this type of problem, but it's a very traffic-based approach, right? So you're looking at traffic. Typically, that's looking at traffic from your site out to the internet, kind of on key choke points, but it's not seeing a lot of that, traffic that's, once again, it's not seeing what's off your network. It's not seeing devices that are paired to the devices on your network. It's really looking at key places in your environment. And then finally, MDM, right? So I think when people tend to think of mobile devices or BYOD, they tend to think of MDM. And I like to call that, it's my device, man. So I think there's a lot of pushback from people of, hey, it's my device. I don't want you putting an agent on there for, one. Two, I think you're going to see just the amount, the diversity of devices that's coming out that are going to be more and more embedded in everyday business, that you won't be able to put these types of agents on all this stuff. They won't be able to support it. They don't have enough horsepower. And trying to keep up, these agent providers, trying to keep up with all this diversity of devices, I think is going to be pretty hard. And without those devices, there's not much to see or secure or control when you talk about MDM. So that to me leads to what I call kind of the BYOD and IoT security pledge, right? And I think to me it's a little bit just really understanding that, hey, I'm responsible for security, but I no longer have the control I'm used to having, right? Second, I think is that the notion that my own network is just one part of what I really need to understand, because more and more we're going to see new networks, new devices floating around our networks that want to interact, that if we're just looking only at our network, we're really missing the full picture of what it is to secure data and enterprises today. And then finally, I think, and this has always been, I think, a hard thing for security, is that stuff happens really, like the Bluetooth locks. Things happen, people don't think of the security implications, and you're usually finding out, afterwards. And so that's going to happen more and more with IoT. I think we're going to see IoT networks spinning up in the enterprise, and we're going to have to be ready to, secure them without trying to put roadblocks up of you can't do this, right? You have to be able, people are going to want to do this, it's going to happen, and how do we actually detect those, and they understand what's going on, and then protect those environments. So that's what we've been focused on, is really kind of trying to figure out how do you go secure these environments. And we really look at it as looking at it from the airspace in rather than the infrastructure out. So being able to look, and discover on the bottom all the devices in your network, whether they're wireless, wired, Bluetooth, cellular, whether they're owned by you, whether they're infrastructure or ad hoc mode, whether they're client-based, and really detect all of those, and then look at how they're related to each other and what they're connecting to, analyzing those configs so you understand, what kind of threat they pose to your environment. And so it's really, we think the way to look at this is not, here's my infrastructure, look out, what's around my environment, trying to connect, or part of my environment, or trying to connect to my environment. And so we've actually built an IoT security platform where you put sensors just around. It listens to everything that's in your environment, senses all the devices. It can connect into your wired network and see. But we really think this is a way of, you just need to kind of be in that same physical space to understand what wired is there, what wireless is there, what Bluetooth is there, and how are they all intercommunicating. And you find some really fascinating stuff. We were brought in to cover the Super Bowl, where they had 1,200 access points. They, which were providing Wi-Fi access to everyday, ticket holders. They also had wireless POS systems. So when you came in, they're basically scanning your badge, your ticket to make sure you get in. That's all Wi-Fi enabled. They have all the coaches, right? The teams are all using the Surface pads. They're all on a Wi-Fi network that's isolated as well. You've got interactive, Bluetooth kind of proximity interactive, which we're seeing more and more, where people actually want to engage with you, so you walk by and there's engagement. So those types of environments, I think, are what we're going to see, where it's not one network segmented. There's a bunch of different business-critical networks floating around. So it's really kind of interesting. Another really interesting use case I found was that we have a customer who they basically own a bunch of performing arts centers. And what they noticed were people dropping iBeacons. I don't know if people are familiar with iBeacons, but they're basically they noticed that people were dropping iBeacons in to then try to take over people's phones and show their ads to customers in these performing arts centers. So it's just an example of where, you might not consider that trying to take data or data theft or, security, but it's basically, if I have a bunch of customers, someone's trying to come in and take their experience away from me as the company and really start to do their own experience. So it's really fascinating the types of things we're starting to see as more and more of these devices get into the area. So that's it in terms of what I want to share. Are there any questions? Happy to take them. Okay. Was there a question? So. Yeah, so the question was, is Bluetooth, wireless, and ZigBee, is it starting to be a concern yet? And I'd say, yeah, we're starting to see, not everywhere, but there's certain, so I think first you had Bluetooth, which was kind of mostly kind of consumer, small. Now we're seeing Bluetooth low energy used a lot and really becoming one of the backbones of kind of the IoT devices for sharing information. And absolutely, we're, certain markets, we're seeing a lot of interest in Bluetooth as a threat vector, but it's still pretty early. And I think ZigBee, the other thing with IoT is I think the standards are really still forming of what's going to be the dominant machine-to-machine protocol for IoT. There's some emerging, but I think that's very nascent. Question? Yes? Yep. So the question, I think the question, just so everyone knows, is how do you do this? Or don't? Yeah. So what we do is we have what we do is basically have a sensor that's out there collecting all this information in your airspace and your wired networks, and then it's sending it up to a cloud portal where we have all the intelligence and our analytics that is basically looking at all that behavior, all that connectivity of those devices. And so whether it's things like what device-to-device communication is there, what type of networks, right? We really look at networks more of a mesh and connections of devices, not just here's a network, I own this network, here are the devices. Here's a device that's connected to this network. It's been connected to this network. And we draw that out so you historically can trend different devices. We can see what devices, if I'm come into the office, I go home, I come back, we can see what networks I was connected to when I was not in the office. So all of that we can track, and these devices are very chatty and, keep a lot of history. You'd be surprised how much information, you were asking about Bluetooth, Jen was asking about Bluetooth. The amount of information that Bluetooth beacons out is quite amazing. And back to the point of a lot of these new devices that are using Bluetooth, they're unencrypted sometimes. I mean, they just security hasn't come to them. And so a lot of it, like, for example, out of there was a presentation at DEF CON where I think out of 16 of the, major manufacturers of Bluetooth locks, they are able to wirelessly pop 12 of them, right? One of them that was touted to have really good security, yes, it was pretty good wireless, Bluetooth-wise. They just took a screwdriver and turned it. So they focused well, I think, on the technology side, but they forgot the lock side. So, it's kind of fascinating, that melding of the physical and the information world. So, great. Okay, well, thank you very much.